When federal records fail to mention an entire family's existence, three possibilities exist: a bureaucratic error, a deliberate omission, or something that should never have been discovered. In March 1874, a young census taker arrived at Hawthorne Plantation in Wilcox County, Alabama, carrying official forms and the conviction that numbers always tell the truth. 3 weeks later, he would leave that property with blank pages, trembling hands, and the certainty that some numbers are left out of the books for reasons beyond any administrative logic. This is the story of what happens when someone counts what should never be counted. Thomas Whitley was 23 years old when the Census Bureau assigned him to the southwestern region of Alabama. The son of a mathematics professor from Boston, Thomas had grown up believing the world could be understood through numbers, categories, and organized records. The Civil War had ended 9 years earlier, and the federal government was determined to rebuild not just the roads and bridges of the South, but also its official records. Complete censuses, they told Thomas during his training in Montgomery, were the foundation of a civilized nation. He arrived in Wilcox County on a March afternoon that smelled of wet earth and burning wood smoke. The southern spring was different from anything he'd known in Massachusetts. The air carried a humid weight that stuck to skin, and fields stretched in all directions with a vastness that made him feel very small. Thomas carried a leather briefcase with his forms, 3 pens, 2 bottles of ink, and a personal notebook where he recorded observations that didn't fit into official categories. The work was methodical. He visited each property, knocked on doors, presented his credentials, and conducted standardized interviews. Full name, age, place of birth, occupation, ability to read and write. For each family, each worker, each child. The numbers accumulated on his pages with the precision of an inventory. During the first 2 weeks, Thomas visited 17 properties. He found white farmers living in houses that had once been imposing mansions, now peeling and needing repairs. He found black families working as sharecroppers on land they'd once cultivated as slaves, paying rent to the same men who had once owned them. The numbers revealed a complex reality that neither side of the war had fully anticipated. But the numbers also revealed patterns. On the evening of March 18th, Thomas sat in his room at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house in Camden and reviewed his forms by lamplight. He'd begun to notice something strange. 5 of the properties he'd visited had discrepancies, not errors in the current numbers, but inconsistencies when compared to pre-war plantation censuses. Green Plantation had 38 workers listed in its 1860 census. Now it had 41 sharecroppers. Reasonable population growth, especially considering many freedmen had remained on the lands they knew. Dobson Plantation had 52 slaves in 1860. Now it had 27 sharecroppers. Many had left, seeking opportunities in other regions, also reasonable. But then there was Hawthorne Plantation. Thomas had found the reference in county archives, a 1860 plantation census listing 63 slaves on Jonathan Hawthorne's property. It was one of the largest cotton operations in the region. Tax records showed the property continued to operate, producing cotton and corn. Yet none of the workers Thomas had spoken with at neighboring properties had mentioned Hawthorne Plantation. When he'd asked the owner of Green Plantation about nearby properties, the man had listed several but omitted Hawthorne. When Thomas mentioned the name specifically, the farmer had fallen silent for a moment before saying he didn't have much contact with those folks. Stranger still, Thomas couldn't find records of land sales, property inventories, or any post-war documentation related to Hawthorne Plantation. The property simply existed in 1860 and apparently still existed now, but there was a complete void of information between those 2 points. The following morning, Thomas asked Mrs. Crawford about the property. Hawthorne, as she repeated, stirring eggs in an iron skillet. Yes, I know the place. It's about 15 miles west, near the Alabama River. Does anyone still live there? Mrs. Crawford didn't respond immediately. She continued stirring the eggs, the sound of the spatula against iron filling the silence. I suppose so, she said finally. I don't go much in that direction. Do you know the current owner? The Hawthorns were always a private family. She placed the eggs on his plate with more force than necessary. They mind their business, we mind ours. Thomas noticed she hadn't answered his question. Part 2. The Road to Hawthorne. Thomas rented a horse and buggy at a local stable. The owner, an elderly man with gnarled hands, grew uncomfortable when Thomas mentioned his destination. Hawthorne, is it? The man checked the buggy straps with excessive attention. Roads bad in that direction. Spring rains left everything muddy. Will I be able to get through? Get through you might, but might be better to wait until next week when the weather firms up. I have deadlines to meet, Thomas said firmly. The government expects me to complete my circuit. The man nodded slowly, then looked Thomas in the eyes. You're new around here, so maybe you don't know. But there are properties where visitors are welcome and properties where they're not. The Hawthorns, well, they don't take kindly to unannounced visits. I'm a federal officer conducting a mandatory census, Thomas replied, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when he felt his authority being questioned. I'm not asking permission. The man said nothing more. The road west was exactly as bad as advertised. The buggy moved slowly through trails that oscillated between dry dust and sticky mud, passing abandoned fields where wild cotton grew in ghostly rows. Thomas passed 3 smaller properties, all showing signs of occupation, but no visible activity. Smoke rose from chimneys, clothes dried on lines, but he saw no people. After 4 hours, the road narrowed until it became little more than 2 wheel tracks winding between pine trees. The vegetation grew denser, rows of ancient trees creating a canopy that blocked the afternoon sun. The temperature dropped, and Thomas realized he could see his breath in the air. Then the forest opened, and he saw Hawthorne Plantation for the first time. The main house rose at the end of an oak-lined avenue. It was a large 2-story structure, antebellum style, with white columns at the front. But something was wrong with it. It took a moment for Thomas to identify what bothered him. The house was perfectly maintained. There was no peeling paint, rotting wood, or broken windows. In a region where even the wealthiest properties showed signs of post-war deterioration, this house looked recently painted. Beyond the main house, Thomas saw the quarters, the slave cabins, now presumably occupied by free workers. There were at least 20 visible structures arranged in 2 orderly rows. Smoke rose from some chimneys. In the distance he could see fields prepared for planting, barns, and a structure that appeared to be a smokehouse. But as with the properties he'd passed on the road, there were no visible people. Thomas guided the buggy down the avenue. The only sound was the clop, clop, clop of horse hooves and the creak of wheels. He expected someone to appear, a worker coming from the fields, a child running from the house, a dog barking, but nothing moved except the oak leaves in the wind. He stopped the buggy in front of the main house and climbed down. His boots made 2 loud noises on the wooden porch steps. The front door was solid oak with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Thomas knocked 3 times. For a long moment nothing happened. He was about to knock again when he heard footsteps from the other side. The door opened. A white man of approximately 50 years stood in the threshold. He had graying hair carefully combed, a precisely trimmed mustache, and wore a dark suit that would be appropriate in a Montgomery law office. His eyes were pale gray and studied Thomas with an intensity that made the young census taker feel instantly assessed and judged. "Can I help you?" The voice was polite but not warm. "My name is Thomas Whitley. I'm a federal census taker assigned to Wilcox County." Thomas showed his credentials. "I'm conducting the official census and need to collect information about all residents of this property." The man looked at the credentials without touching them. "I see. My name is Edmund Hawthorne. This is my property. Are you descended from Jonathan Hawthorne?" "I'm his son." Thomas nodded and pulled out his notebook. "Mr. Hawthorne, I need to record information about you and everyone who resides or works on this property. According to the 1860 census, there were 63 slaves listed here. I presume many now work as free employees or sharecroppers." Edmund Hawthorne was silent for a moment. Mr. Whitley, as you can see, my property is considerably isolated. We don't typically receive official visitors. The census is mandatory under federal law, sir. I'm not asking permission, I'm performing my assigned duty. Of course. Edmund gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I appreciate the dedication to duty. However, it's late in the afternoon, you've traveled a long distance, and this process will presumably take considerable time. Perhaps it would be better for you to return tomorrow morning, when you can begin with full daylight. Thomas looked at the sky. The sun was low, but there were still at least 2 hours of daylight. Sir, I would prefer to begin today. I insist. Edmund's voice remained polite but took on a tone of finality. The road back is treacherous at nightfall. You're welcome to return tomorrow at dawn. I'll be expecting you. There was something in the way he said it. I'll be expecting you. That made Thomas hesitate. It wasn't exactly a threat, but there was a quality of warning in those words. Very well, Thomas said finally. I'll return tomorrow at 7 in the morning. Excellent. Until tomorrow, Mr. Whitley. Edmund closed the door before Thomas could say anything else. Thomas rode back to Camden as the sun set, painting the sky deep orange and red. His mind worked on the Hawthorne problem, the cold reception, the perfectly maintained property, the complete absence of visible workers. It all added up to something he couldn't fully articulate, but which left him deeply uncomfortable. At the boarding house, he found Mrs. Crawford preparing dinner. 2 other guests were seated in the parlor, a traveling salesman and a lawyer from Montgomery visiting local clients. Did you make it to Hawthorne? Mrs. Crawford asked as she placed bread and stew on the table. I did. I met Edmund Hawthorne. I'm going back tomorrow to conduct the census properly. The salesman, a portly man named Porter, looked up. Edmund Hawthorne. I thought old Jonathan was still alive. Edmund is the son. He said the property is his now. Interesting. Porter chewed thoughtfully. I've been coming to this region for 15 years, since before the war. I always did business with Jonathan. Sold him agricultural supplies, tools, things like that. But for the past 5 years, I haven't been able to make a single sale to that property. They always say they already have everything they need. Perhaps they do, Mrs. Crawford said quickly. Some properties are more self-sufficient than others. No property is that self-sufficient, Porter insisted. Everyone needs nails, rope, replacement tools, seeds. It's impossible to produce everything yourself. The lawyer, a thin man named Larson, interjected. I've worked on several property cases in this county over the past 2 years. Inheritance issues, boundary disputes, title transfers. It's remarkable that I've never come across any legal documents related to Hawthorne Plantation. No recorded deeds, no filed wills, no property litigation. For a property of that size, that's highly unusual. Maybe they just avoid legal troubles, Mrs. Crawford suggested, but her voice sounded strained. Thomas seized the opening. Mrs. Crawford, you mentioned the Hawthornes were always a private family. How long have they owned that land? She hesitated. Jonathan Hawthorne built that house in the 1830s, I believe. 40 years ago, maybe more. And did you know his family? His wife? His children? I saw Mrs. Hawthorne a few times years ago. She was a quiet woman. Didn't socialize much. Mrs. Crawford began collecting plates despite everyone still eating. And as for the children, well, like I said, they kept the children out of the public eye. Children, Thomas repeated. Did Edmund mention other family members? I didn't ask. But in the 1860 census, Jonathan Hawthorne is listed with a wife and 3 children. Edmund would be one of them. There must be at least 2 more. Mrs. Crawford didn't respond. She carried the plates to the kitchen, and the sounds of dishes being washed filled the uncomfortable silence. Larson, the lawyer, looked at Thomas with renewed interest. Are you saying you can't find records of the family after 1860? I can't find anything. No tax records specifying how many residents, no documentation about the transition from slave to free labor, no worker lists, nothing. The property exists, apparently still produces crops, but it's as if the people living there simply aren't being counted. Counted by whom? Porter asked. By anyone. Not by the county, not by the state, not by the federal government. It's as if 63 people simply disappeared from paper. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Crawford returning from the kitchen. Gentlemen, I believe it's getting late. I have to wake up early tomorrow. It was clearly a dismissal, but Thomas had one last question. Mrs. Crawford, if I could ask, when was the last time you actually saw anyone from Hawthorne Plantation? Not heard about them, but saw them personally. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her back turned to them. I'm not sure, it's been a while. A year? 5 years? More. Her voice was low. I haven't seen anyone from that property in over 10 years, maybe more. No one comes to town, no one goes to church, no one does business. It's like you said, Mr. Whitley. It's as if they're not being counted. But some things, she turned to look at him, and her eyes held an expression Thomas couldn't read, aren't counted for a good reason. She went to her room and closed the door. Thomas slept poorly that night. His dreams were filled with census pages where numbers kept changing whenever he looked at them. 63, then 42, then 17, then none. Blank spaces where there should be names. He woke before dawn, dressed quickly, and left the boarding house before Mrs. Crawford woke. He didn't want more conversations that might make his determination waver. The road to Hawthorne was shrouded in morning fog. The horse moved at a steady pace, its breath creating clouds in the cold air. Thomas passed the abandoned properties again, and this time noticed something he'd missed the day before. There were recent wheel tracks in the road, as if several wagons had passed recently. But in which direction? It was impossible to tell. He arrived at Hawthorne's Oak Avenue at 7:15. The sun was rising, casting long, golden rays through the trees. The main house looked different in morning light, less imposing perhaps, but also more real. Smoke rose from the chimney. Thomas grabbed his briefcase with the census forms and walked to the front door. This time Edmund Hawthorne opened before he could knock, as if he'd been waiting right behind the door. Mr. Whitley, punctual as expected, please come in. The interior of the house was as well maintained as the exterior. The entrance hall had polished wood floors, a crystal chandelier, and antique furniture that appeared original from the 1830s. Portraits hung on the walls. Men with severe mustaches, women in high-collared dresses, children posing rigidly. Edmund led him to a wood-paneled office. A large desk dominated the space, covered with carefully arranged account books. Edmund indicated a chair for Thomas and sat behind the desk. I presume you have your questions prepared, Edmund said. Thomas opened his notebook. Let's start with you. Full name? Edmund Jonathan Hawthorne. Age? 52 years. Place of birth? Here, in this house. Thomas wrote, then asked. Marital status? A pause. Widowed. Children? None. Occupation? Landowner and farmer. Can you read and write? Yes. Thomas continued through the standard questions, and Edmund answered each with the same concise precision. But when Thomas asked about other residents of the house, Edmund hesitated for the first time. Other residents, he repeated. Yes. The 1860 census lists your father Jonathan Hawthorne, your mother Sarah, and 3 children, presumably you and 2 siblings. Where are they now? My father died in 1862. My mother died in 1865. My 2 brothers no longer live here. They left the property? Yes. And where did they go? We don't maintain correspondence. Thomas noted this, though it seemed strange. What about other family members, cousins, uncles, dependents? There's no one else in the main house. And the workers? The 1860 census lists 63 slaves on this property. How many remained after emancipation? Edmund became very quiet. His fingers drummed once on the desk, a movement so brief Thomas almost missed it. None. None? Thomas looked up from his notes. Mr. Hawthorne, I saw the quarters outside. I saw smoke from chimneys. I saw fields prepared for planting. Someone is working this land. You asked how many remained after emancipation, and I answered honestly, none. All who were here in 1865 left. Then who works the property now? I hired new workers. How many? The number varies. I need an exact number, Mr. Hawthorne. That's what I'm here for. Edmund stood and walked to the window. He looked out for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Mr. Whitley, I must make a confession. I don't keep complete records of my workers. Some come seasonally, work for a few weeks or months, and then move on. It's difficult to maintain precise count. It's unusual for an operation of this size not to keep payroll records. Perhaps. But I value privacy, and many who work here value it as well. They prefer informal arrangements. Thomas felt his frustration growing. Mr. Hawthorne, I'm not here to judge your business arrangements, but the federal census is mandatory. I need to count every person who resides or works regularly on this property. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll be forced to report that refusal to federal authorities. Edmund turned from the window. For the first time, something passed across his carefully controlled expression. Not exactly anger, but something colder. Assessment, perhaps, as if he were measuring Thomas and calculating odds. Very well, Edmund said finally. If you insist, I can take you to the quarters. You can count the workers personally. But you must understand, they're simple people, not accustomed to government officials. They may not answer your questions easily. That's acceptable. I'm accustomed to working with varied populations. Then let's go. Edmund took a coat from a hook near the door. But Mr. Whitley, a warning. Don't attempt to speak with the workers without my presence. They trust me, and only me. Any attempt to bypass my authority will only frighten them and make your work more difficult. It was a strange demand, but Thomas nodded. He followed Edmund out of the house. The morning had warmed slightly, though the air was still cold. Edmund led Thomas along a path that wound behind the main house, through an abandoned garden where wild roses grew unchecked, and to the area where the quarters were located. As they approached, Thomas could see the structures more clearly. There were 20 cabins arranged in 2 parallel rows, each identical. Mud-covered plank walls, shingled roofs, a small window, a door. They were better-built structures than many slave quarters he'd seen, but still basic. Smoke rose from 8 of the 20 chimneys. Only 8 cabins occupied? Thomas asked. At the moment, yes. As I mentioned, the number varies. They walked to the first cabin. Edmund knocked on the door 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. A pattern, Thomas noted. A code. The door opened slightly, and a middle-aged black man appeared. He looked at Edmund, then at Thomas, and immediately his face assumed a neutral, closed expression Thomas recognized. The mask that oppressed people learned to wear around white authorities. "This is Mr. Whitley," Edmund said. "He's a federal census taker. He needs to ask some questions." The man said nothing. Thomas pulled out his notebook. "Your name, sir?" Silence. "It's an official record," Thomas said gently. "It won't bring any trouble. I just need your name." The man looked at Edmund, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Robert," the man said finally. His voice was low, scratchy. "Surname?" "Just Robert." "Age?" "Don't know exactly. 40-something. "Where were you born?" "Georgia, I reckon." Thomas continued asking questions, and Robert answered each with minimal reluctance. He worked in the fields, had no family, couldn't read or write. The answers were adequate but completely empty of detail. It was like filling a form with placeholders instead of real people. They moved to the second occupied cabin. A woman this time, who identified herself as Hannah, approximately 30 years old. Same vague answers, same monotone. No family, no history, no details. At the third cabin they found 2 men. Brothers, they said, named Marcus and James. Both in their 20s, both with the same carefully empty non-answers. By the 4th cabin a pattern was forming. All the workers were black. All claimed to have arrived in recent years. None had family connections on the property. None had specific stories about where they came from or why they came to Hawthorne. None maintained contact with the outside world. And something else Thomas was beginning to notice. They all looked tired. Not the normal tiredness of hard agricultural work, but something deeper. Exhaustion in the eyes, weight in the shoulders, a quality of heaviness that seemed to infuse every movement. At the fifth cabin, they found a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children. The man identified himself as Samuel. When Thomas asked about the children, Samuel hesitated for a long time before answering. "This is Jacob, he's 8. This is Mercy, she's 6. The children stood behind their mother, looking at Thomas with wide eyes. He smiled at them, trying to be reassuring. "Do you go to school?" Before the children could answer, Edmund intervened. "There's no school close enough. The children help with light tasks on the property." Thomas looked at the children again. There was something about their faces that disturbed him. It took a moment to identify. It was the lack of expression. Children should be curious, excited, scared, something. But these children looked at him with the same empty gaze as the adults. They visited the 3 remaining occupied cabins. More solitary workers, more empty answers. When they finished, Thomas had 8 adults and 2 children listed on his forms. 10 people total. 10 people working a property that once employed 63. "Is that it?" Thomas asked when they returned to the open area between the rows of cabins. 10 people manage this entire operation? I said the number varies. More will come when planting season is in full swing. What about the 12 empty cabins? When were they last occupied? I don't keep such detailed records. Thomas looked at Edmund, trying to read the older man's expression. There was something wrong here. Deeply wrong, but he couldn't articulate exactly what. The workers weren't visibly injured or abused. They didn't appear to be working in chains. But there was a quality around them, an atmosphere Thomas couldn't name. "Mr. Hawthorne, I need to ask a direct question. Are these workers free to leave if they choose?" Edmund smiled coldly. "Mr. Whitley, slavery was abolished. Everyone here is legally free. If they wanted to leave, they could do so. Then why don't they leave? Where would they go? They have shelter here, food, work. The outside world is harsh for people without resources or connections. They choose to stay because it's their best option." It was a reasonable answer, perfectly logical. So why did Thomas feel like he'd just heard a lie? Edmund started to lead him back to the main house, but Thomas stopped. "I also need to see your agricultural structures, barns, equipment sheds, outbuildings, to have a complete record of the property." "Is that necessary for a population census?" "Complete property record, yes." Edmund hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. The main barns are that way." They walked across fields toward a complex of wooden structures. The larger barn was 3 stories, the kind built to store large quantities of cotton and tobacco. Next to it was a smaller barn, a workshop, and what appeared to be a smokehouse. Edmund opened the door to the large barn, and they entered a cavernous space that smelled of hay and aged wood. Sunlight entered through cracks in the walls, creating dusty beams. The ground floor was almost empty, just some haystacks and agricultural tools lined neatly along one wall. "Not much stored now," Edmund explained. "Last year's harvest was sold. The new crop won't come until fall." Thomas walked through the space, making notes about dimensions and conditions. He was about to ask about the second floor when he noticed something strange. On the back wall of the barn there was a row of hooks, the kind used to hang harnesses, ropes, and equipment. But only half the hooks had anything hanging on them. The others were empty but showed clear marks of recent use. Indentations in the wood where something heavy had hung for a long time. And beneath those empty hooks, on the packed dirt floor, there were dark stains. Thomas knelt to examine them more closely. The stains formed patterns, elongated shapes, approximately the size of a human body. "Mr. Hawthorne, what was hanging here?" Edmund had moved to stand between Thomas and the door. "Agricultural equipment. Tools. We move things as needed." These stains look old, as if something had been here for years and dripped something onto the floor. Equipment oil. Grease. This is a working barn, Mr. Whitley, not a museum. Thomas stood, his heart beating faster. There was a quality in Edmund's voice now, a tension that hadn't been there before. I'd like to see the second floor. There's nothing up there. Still, I'd like to see it. The two men stared at each other. For a moment, Thomas thought Edmund was going to refuse. Then the older man gestured to a ladder leading upward. After you. Thomas climbed the ladder, acutely aware of Edmund climbing right behind him. The second floor was an open space used to store hay. But like the ground floor, it was almost empty. There were only 3 notable things: a row of windows on the south side, a pile of chains and shackles in one corner, and a collection of notebooks stacked neatly on a beam. Thomas walked to the notebooks. There were 12 of them, each with a leather cover and pages yellowed with age. May I look at these? They're old account books. Agricultural records from before the war. They have no relevance to your census. Thomas picked up the first book. The title page read, Hawthorne Plantation, Account Book, 1858. He flipped through it. There were records of seed purchases, cotton sales, maintenance expenses. Everything seemed normal. Then he reached a section in the middle of the book marked Property Inventory, and his breath froze. The page listed names, 63 names, men, women, children. Each name had an age, a physical description, an estimated monetary value, and, more strangely, a number next to it. Number 1, Samuel, male, 28 years, good field worker, $200. Number 2, Eliza, female, 24 years, domestic work, $900. Number 3, Thomas, male, 6 years, healthy child, $500. The list continued. It was a slave inventory, the kind of horrible but common document from before the war. But what made Thomas's stomach turn was that the numbers continued beyond 63. Number 64, Marcus, male, 22 years. Number 65, Hannah, female, 19 years. Number 66, Jacob, male, 5 years. And the numbers kept going, 67, 68, 69, up to 84. Thomas flipped through the other books quickly. Each year had a similar list. The numbers always went up. In 1859, the list went to 91. In 1860, to 98. In 1861, to 107. But the official 1860 census listed only 63 slaves. Mr. Hawthorne, Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly. Can you explain this? Edmund had climbed the stairs silently and now stood beside Thomas. He looked at the books with an unreadable expression. Agricultural records, as I said. These are slave inventories, and they list far more people than the official census ever recorded. More than 40 additional people. Accounting errors. Duplicates, perhaps. Sir, these are not accounting errors. These are careful, consistent records of people who existed but were never officially counted. Thomas felt anger growing through his fear. These are people who were kept here illegally, hidden from official records. Edmund was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very calm, almost reflective. Mr. Whitley, let me ask you a question. You're a man of numbers, of records, of official order. So tell me, what happens to people who aren't counted? If someone never appears in a census, is never recorded in any legal document, officially never existed, what happens to that person? They still exist. Documents don't determine existence, don't they? Edmund picked up one of the books and flipped through it. Suppose a farmer wanted to buy more slaves than the law allowed him to bring into the state. Suppose he found suppliers who could provide people who were never recorded on any ship manifest, any auction sale, any transfer document. Would those people exist? Thomas felt cold running down his spine. You're describing slave smuggling, illegal trafficking. I'm describing hypothetically, but yes, that's what we're talking about. And when the war ended, when emancipation was declared, what do you think happened to people who officially never existed? How could they be freed if they were never officially enslaved? They were still entitled to freedom. The 13th Amendment made no exceptions. Exceptions? Edmund laughed, a hard sound without humor. Mr. Whitley, you're young. You don't understand how the world really works. People without records, without families looking for them, without documentation of their existence, those people can disappear and no one would ever know. No one could know, because for all official purposes they were never here. Thomas took a step back. His entire body was trembling now. What did you do with them? Me? I did nothing. My father, however. Edmund looked out the window at the property below. My father was a pragmatic man. When he bought people who weren't in the official books, he kept them that way. He built extra cabins beyond the visible quarters. He kept them away from roads, away from visitors, away from official eyes. And when the war ended, when federal officers came to make their inspections and announce emancipation, they only counted the 63 people who were in the official books. The others, well, how could he report people who officially didn't exist? But they existed. They were human beings. Where are they now? Edmund turned to look at him. His eyes were completely cold. Some ran away during the war when the overseers left to fight. Some died of disease and work. Some, he paused, were transferred. Transferred where? To other operations where their lack of official papers made them valuable. There's always a market for labor that doesn't need to be recorded, Mr. Whitley. You'd be surprised how many wealthy people in the South, and in the North, by the way, employ workers without documentation, without wages, without the annoying protection of federal laws. Thomas felt sick. You're describing continuing slavery, years after abolition. I'm describing economic realities. I'm describing what happens to people who fall through the cracks of your precious official records. Do you want to count them now? Edmund gestured to the notebooks. Add 44 ghosts to your census, people who exist in old books but nowhere else. And the workers I met today in the quarters? Ah, yes. Edmund smiled. Those are different. Those came voluntarily, you know. Desperate people. Nowhere to go. No family looking for them. I offer shelter, food, work. I don't hurt them, I don't chain them. But I also don't register them, I don't report them. And they stay because... He paused. Because they understand that outside these boundaries, the world is no kinder to them than I am. At least here, they exist. Even if only I know it. Thomas backed toward the ladder. Every fiber of his body was screaming for him to leave that barn, ride back to Camden, and report everything he'd discovered. But Edmund blocked his path. Where are you going, Mr. Whitley? I'm going back to Camden and reporting what I found here to appropriate federal authorities. And report what exactly? That you found some old account books describing transactions that happened before the war. That you met 10 workers who choose to remain here. That you don't like how I manage my property. I'll report that you're keeping people in illegal servitude. Prove it. Edmund took a step closer. Bring a sheriff here. Bring a federal officer. Bring an entire commission. Let them interview my workers. Those people will say they choose to be here, that they're paid in accommodation and food, that they can leave when they want. Can you prove otherwise? Thomas didn't answer. And as for my private account books, well, those are private property. Confidential business records. You took them without permission, without a warrant. Any evidence you gather would be inadmissible. Edmund smiled. You're a man of rules, Mr. Whitley, so you know I'm right. The people in the books are no longer here, transferred, dead, lost to history. You can search for them, but how do you search for people who were never officially recorded? There are no birth records, no real surnames, no documentation. They're ghosts, Mr. Whitley, and ghosts can't be counted in a census. Thomas felt despair growing in his chest. Edmund was right. All he had were old books describing crimes that had happened years ago, with no identifiable victims, no living perpetrators except Edmund, whose most recent crimes were... what, exactly? Employing people without registering them? Running an informal agricultural operation? These weren't crimes that underfunded federal authorities would prioritize, especially against a wealthy white landowner in a region still resisting reconstruction. Then let me go, Thomas said. Of course. Edmund moved away from the ladder. "You're free to leave at any time. Complete your census, return to Camden, report whatever you want. But consider this. How many other places like this exist? How many other properties have hidden quarters and double books? How many people live uncounted across the South? You can report one property, but can you stop the system? Can you account for everyone who's fallen through the cracks?" Thomas descended the ladder without answering. He crossed the barn, stepped out into the sunlight, and walked quickly back to where he'd left his buggy. Edmund followed at a casual distance, unhurried. At the buggy, Thomas grabbed his reins with trembling hands. Edmund stood beside it, looking up with an almost paternal expression. "One last thing, Mr. Whitley. You came here to count people. You counted 10. That's your official answer. If you try to report anything else, you'll discover there's no evidence to support it. The books you saw, you won't be able to find them again. The workers you met, they'll confirm they're here by choice. And as for any other people, well, as we've already established, people who were never counted can't be uncounted." He patted the side of the buggy. "Have a safe trip back." Thomas rode back to Camden in a daze. His mind spun through what he'd discovered, trying to find some action he could take, some authority who would listen. But the more he thought, the more he saw the truth in Edmund's warning. What could he actually prove? When he arrived at the boarding house, it was already late afternoon. Mrs. Crawford looked at his face and immediately made strong tea. "Didn't go well, I imagine." "No." Thomas sat heavily at the kitchen table. "Mrs. Crawford, what do you know about Hawthorne Plantation?" "The truth this time." She sighed and sat across from him. "I know what everyone knows, but what no one says. Jonathan Hawthorne trafficked slaves illegally. Not the ones who came through normal channels, but ones who were smuggled. Africans brought directly long after the slave trade was banned, children bought from foreign states, people stolen from small farms and sold without documentation. He kept them hidden, unreported, working on parts of his property that visitors never saw. Why didn't anyone report him? To whom? Before the war, slavery was legal. What authority would care if he had more slaves than he reported in his census? He paid taxes on 63. That was all that mattered officially. And after the war, she shook her head. After the war, we all had secrets we wanted to bury. Every property in this region did things during those years that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. No one wanted to point fingers because no one wanted to be examined in turn. But those people are still there. Edmund still keeps unregistered workers. And can you prove it? Can you identify them individually? Can you trace where they came from, what families are looking for them?" Mrs. Crawford touched his hand gently. "Mr. Whitley, I understand your anger. It's admirable. But you're fighting against a current much deeper than you realize. There are hundreds of operations like this across the South, thousands maybe. People working illegally, living in the shadows, uncounted because it's more convenient for those in power to keep them that way." Thomas pulled his hand back. "So what am I supposed to do? Just write 10 names on my form and pretend I didn't see the books? Pretend I don't know about the other 44 people? 44 people who are probably no longer there. What about the 10 who are? What about all the other people like them on all the other properties? Mrs. Crawford, if we don't count these people, if we let them remain hidden and unrecognized, we're as guilty as those who hide them. Then count them." She stood and began preparing dinner. "Write a complete report. Send it to your superiors in Montgomery or even to Washington. See if anyone acts. But don't expect it to change anything, Mr. Whitley. The system was built to have cracks, and certain people will always fall through them." That night, Thomas sat in his room with a pen and blank paper. He wrote and rewrote his report a dozen times. Each version sounded weaker than the last. Suspected labor irregularities. Possible non-compliance with emancipation laws. Additional investigation recommended. Words that meant nothing. Words that bureaucrats in Montgomery would read and file and forget. Finally, he wrote the truth. Hawthorne Plantation, property of Edmund Hawthorne, Currently employs 10 workers without formal employment records. Historical account books indicate the property maintained unreported slaves before and during the Civil War. Exact number of victims unknown. Current whereabouts of most individuals listed in private records unknown. Recommendation: complete federal investigation with authority to seize private records and interview all workers without owner presence. He knew it would come to nothing, but at least he would have told the truth. Thomas completed his circuit of Wilcox County over the next 2 weeks. He visited 32 more properties, counted 612 more people, filled out 83 more forms. Good, thorough work. But he couldn't stop thinking about Hawthorne. Before leaving Camden to return to Montgomery, he made one last attempt. He rode back to Hawthorne Plantation, this time without announcing his coming. He arrived at noon on a clear April day. The property was empty. Not just empty of people, which could be explained by everyone working in the fields, but empty in the sense of abandoned. The quarters had no smoke rising from chimneys. The main house had shutters closed. When Thomas knocked on the front door, no one answered. He walked around the property, calling out. Complete silence except for wind in the trees. He went back to the barn where he'd seen the account books. The ladder was still there, but when he climbed to the second floor, the books were gone. The beam where they'd been was empty, except for a thin layer of dust that looked undisturbed for years. At the quarters, he pushed doors open one by one. Each cabin was empty. No furniture, no clothes, no sign anyone had ever lived there. Even the soot in the fireplaces looked old, like from fires made long ago. Thomas stood in the center of the empty quarters complex, turning slowly in a circle. He had been here. He'd spoken with 10 people. He'd written down their names. He'd seen smoke from chimneys, heard their voices. He wasn't crazy. But as he stood in that silent, empty place, a cold doubt crept into his mind. How much of what he'd seen was real? How much was staged? Edmund had known he was coming. Edmund had had time to prepare. The workers Thomas had interviewed, were they real, or were they actors playing roles? The books he'd read so briefly, could they have been forgeries, planted specifically to be found? No. He refused to believe that. The books were too old, the details too specific. No one could falsify decades of accounting records just to deceive a single census taker, which meant everything had been real, and Edmund had simply erased it, moved the workers, destroyed the evidence, and swept the property clean of any proof. Thomas returned to Camden, completed his final paperwork, and left for Montgomery. He turned in his comprehensive report on Hawthorne to his supervisor, a middle-aged man named Harrison, who barely looked up from his desk as he placed the papers on a pile. Labor irregularities? Harrison grunted. Add it to the list. Half a dozen supervisors have reported similar things from across the state. We're underfunded and understaffed. Unless you have evidence of literal slavery, chains, whippings, sale of people, there's little we can do. But the books that you can't produce, that may or may not have existed, Mr. Whitley. Harrison finally looked at him. I understand your frustration, I really do. But there are limits to what we can investigate and prosecute. If every allegation of unfair worker treatment required full federal investigation, we'd need 10,000 agents just for Alabama. We have 52. Do the math. Thomas did the math, and the numbers told him that Edmund Hawthorne was right. Some people would fall through the cracks and no one would come to save them. Thomas Whitley continued working for the Census Bureau for 3 more years. He conducted censuses in 6 different counties, counted thousands of people, filled out thousands of forms. The numbers accumulated, creating a statistical portrait of Reconstruction. But he never forgot Hawthorne. In 1875, he made discreet inquiries. Hawthorne Plantation was still listed in county tax records. Someone was still paying taxes on the property, which meant someone still owned it. But when he tried to find out who, the records became confusing. One will listed Edmund Hawthorne as owner. A tax document listed a corporate trust. A deed record mentioned a company based in Mobile. It was impossible to determine who actually controlled the property. In 1876, Thomas married a woman from Montgomery named Catherine. She was a teacher and shared his passion for justice and his hatred of injustice. He told her about Hawthorne on their honeymoon, unable to keep the secret any longer. "Then let's go there," she said simply. "Let's see for ourselves." They traveled to Wilcox County in May 1876, 2 years after his first visit. Mrs. Crawford's boarding house was still operating, though the lady herself seemed to have aged a decade in 2 years. "Still thinking about Hawthorne?" she said when Thomas mentioned his destination. "Let it be, Mr. Whitley. Some places are better left alone." But he and Catherine went anyway. The property looked exactly as it had on his second visit. Empty, silent, undisturbed. But this time, when they explored more thoroughly, Catherine noticed something he'd missed. "Thomas, look at this." She was near the northern edge of the property, where dense forest met cultivated fields. There were graves, unmarked, just mounds of earth arranged in orderly rows. Catherine counted aloud as they walked among them. 41, 42, 43, 44. 44 graves. Thomas knelt beside the first one. There were no markers, no crosses, no names. Just earth that had been turned over and then left to settle. Some grass had begun to grow over the mounds, which meant they were at least several months old. "The people from the books," Catherine whispered. "He buried them here, or buried evidence." Thomas touched the earth with his hand. It was cold and dry. "Maybe they're not even real graves. Maybe they're just mounds to make us think." "Thomas!" Catherine pointed to a nearby tree. Carved into the bark, almost invisible if you didn't know to look, were marks, not words. Most of those people couldn't write, but symbols, a cross, a circle, a hand. Simple markers made by someone who wanted these places to be remembered, even if they couldn't be named. They stood there for a long time, in the unmarked cemetery of people who had never been officially counted. "What do we do?" Catherine asked finally. "We document." Thomas pulled out his notebook. "We count, we measure, we draw maps, and then we report everything again." They spent 3 hours measuring the burial area, sketching its location, noting the symbols on trees. When they finished, they had a complete record. But as they rode back to Camden, Thomas knew it wouldn't make a difference. Bodies buried without identification, no proof of how they died, when they died, or even who they were. Impossible to even prove they were victims, rather than natural burials of people who lived and died over decades. He sent the report anyway, and as he'd predicted, nothing happened. In 1877, Thomas Whitley left the Census Bureau. He became a teacher like his father, teaching mathematics and accounting at a small college in Massachusetts. He taught generations of students about the importance of accurate records, complete documentation, and honest accounting. But he also taught them about the limits of numbers. "Numbers," he would tell his classes, "can only count what we allow them to count. Every census, every statistic, every official record is a choice about who to include and who to exclude. And the people who are left out of those counts often disappear completely from history." He never mentioned Hawthorne specifically, but every time he taught his students how to conduct population surveys, he warned them to look for the cracks, to ask not just who was being counted, but who might not be. Hawthorne Plantation remained on tax records until 1883, when it was apparently sold. The new owner subdivided the property into smaller lots and sold them to small farmers. The main house was demolished in 1885. The quarters were burned. The fields were plowed again and again, erasing any trace of their previous configuration. And the graves? If the new owners found them, they never mentioned it. Over time, the forest grew back, covering the area where Thomas and Catherine had made their measurements. In 1920, 46 years after Thomas's visit, a complete federal census of Wilcox County, Alabama, made no mention that a Hawthorne plantation had ever existed. The land had been redistributed, renamed, reconfigured. History was buried under layers of new stories. The people who lived there, worked there, and died there disappeared from all official records. They became exactly what Edmund Hawthorne had predicted, Ghosts who could never be counted because they officially never existed, but Thomas Whitley remembered. And in his personal files, kept in a locked metal box in his office until his death in 1932, there was a set of documents. Census forms with 10 names: Robert, Hannah, Marcus, James, Samuel and his family. Maps of a cemetery of 44 unmarked graves. Notes about account books that listed 107 people where official records showed only 63. His daughter found these documents while sorting through his estate. She read through them, trying to understand why her father had kept these papers for almost 60 years. In the end, she made a decision. She donated them to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., with a note: "The family that never appeared in any plantation census, counted only once by a man who believed every person deserved to be remembered." The documents remained archived, uncatalogued and unknown, for 4 more decades. When they were finally discovered by researchers in the 1970s, they led to a re-examination of census records across the South. Scholars began looking for other discrepancies, other properties where the numbers didn't add up, other families who never appeared in official records. They found hundreds, perhaps thousands, people who lived, worked, suffered, died, and left zero official evidence of their existences. People whose names were never written in family Bibles, whose births were never registered, whose deaths were never publicly mourned. People who fell through the cracks that Thomas Whitley had tried to expose, and even now, more than a century later, we still don't know how many there really were. We still can't count them, because the systems designed to count people were built with intentional cracks, places where certain lives could disappear without a trace. Hawthorne Plantation no longer exists, but the principles that allowed its existence, the belief that some people can be kept uncounted, unrecorded, unrecognized, those principles still echo through the systems we build. And somewhere, in every